Welcome to the fifth video in our series on the kingdom motif through the Scriptures. We've been tracing God's eternal purpose to create for Himself a kingdom so that He could bless and protect and live with His people forever. The original creation was intended to be His kingdom. And we saw in Genesis chapters 1 through 11 that in the creation of free will human beings, rebellion was the result. Mankind rebelled against God's eternal kingdom purposes, and so God had to begin new stages in a redemption of His kingdom in order to bring about the fruition and fulfillment of this purposed kingdom. He began to give promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis chapters 12 and following. In our last video, we discovered where God had finally redeemed His people from Egyptian slavery. The seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob brought them to the mountain at Sinai and entered into a covenant so that they would be for Him a kingdom of priests and a holy nation among all the nations of the world. And through that nation, God's intention was to bless all the nations of the earth with the promised seed of Abraham. The New Testament, of course, pictures this as fulfilled in the Christ. When Jesus of Nazareth was born, He was the ultimate fulfillment of these promises to bring about an eternal kingdom. But we're tracing this history through the Old Testament, and we're seeing these various subpoints, the kingdom in purpose, the kingdom in promise form, and we left off last video by discussing the kingdom in prototype form. And so this is what we're going to be looking at and putting closure on this period of Old Testament history in order to continue our survey of the kingdom motif through the Scriptures. And so Israel, the nation of Israel, is God's kingdom in prototypical form. A prototype is like a first edition, an initial edition in order to build upon it, in order to perfect it, in the future. And in this sense, we're saying that Israel as a nation, chosen out of the nations of the world, brought to Sinai, entering into a covenant with God, would really serve as a prototype of God's kingdom rule among His people. And so there are really 2 points under this idea of God's kingdom in prototype seen in the nation of Israel, that Israel was to be God's special people. And through their covenant faithfulness, they would show what it means to bow down and respect the rule of their king, and then in turn their king protect and bless, provide for them, and live in harmony with them. And this, of course, was to be reflected in the nations all around them, or reflected to the nations all around them. They were to be the center of what it means to be true people of the Creator. When they reflected the righteous rule of God in their own lives and in their own obedience, the nations should be drawn to that and to see that there is a true God in heaven that is to be distinguished from the territorial gods of all of the nations around them, and that would be a clarion call from the God of heaven for all nations to join Israel in worshiping the only true God. But as Israel's history plays out, we see that it was not to be so. Israel would not remain faithful to the covenant of Moses. They said in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 5, "Give us a human king. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations." So this is a great offense to God's plan, because God was to have them to be a special nation where He was the sole king. And now they are clamoring to be like the nations. Rather than to be a reflection of a true nation of God, they want to be like the nations around them. But God reassured Samuel, "They have not rejected you. They have rejected me from reigning over them." And so here was a great breaking of the covenant of Moses, where God was to be the only king, and now Israel, seeking to be like the nations around them, are rejecting God's own rule. And so in giving them over to this desire, God then chooses human kings for Israel. And the first king that was chosen was a man named Saul. And I'm going to say here that Saul was a man chosen after the people's heart. In other words, here is a man that embodied the desire of Israel in their own heart. This is the kind of person that Israel wanted to rule over them. They had in their mind this grand military powerful king and somebody who would lead them into battle and bring home the spoils and continue to show their power and prestige in the world. And so God chose Saul according to the desires of the heart of Israel. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, and he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. It says there was not a more handsome person than Saul among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Saul was an imposing figure. Saul was someone who looked the part. He, by all appearances, was exactly what Israel was wanting and what Israel would have chosen. But this, of course, turned into a tragedy. Saul was disobedient to the law of God, and God showed Israel, of course, what it means to be under a monarch that was power-hungry, that would not rule according to the righteous dictates of the God of heaven. And so he chose David. And here the Bible itself says David was a man after God's own heart. So what God is doing now is saying, I am going to choose now a man after my heart, and he will at least reflect in some significant way what it means to rule God's kingdom under the ultimate authority of God. The Lord said to Samuel, whenever he was selecting David as the next king, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature. See, that's exactly what Israel had done with Saul. But the Lord, he says, does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So David is somebody who will serve only Yahweh. David would not be an idolater. David would strive to be obedient to God's law. And so in that sense, God chose David after his own heart. David also will trust in God's strength in battle. David will be one who goes into battle knowing that Yahweh is the true God of heaven, and as God will give the victory. And you have that first example in 1 Samuel chapter 17 with David's battling Goliath, where according to appearance, there would be no chance that David would win this battle. David will reflect God's shepherd heart for his people. See, David was a shepherd when he was chosen in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And so what we have is a picture of a heart that is ready to rule over God's people in a way that Saul's never was. And so God surprisingly enters into a covenant with David and his dynasty. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we will cover this more in our next video, but God does make promises to David in saying, I'm going to set up your seed after you, and there will be a kingdom now that will rule and that will reign forever and ever. So David's dynasty is given promises here concerning the eternal kingdom of God. Just as we had failures, however, with Saul, we have failure with David. Because David not only will be a man after God's heart, but David will also show the pitfalls of human sovereignty. He is, after all, just a man, and he has the same temptations and he has the same weaknesses as all men. And so with David's life, we see the kinds of tragedies that came upon him, the sins and temptations that he fell into with adultery with Bathsheba, murder of Uriah the Hittite, the intrigue and the problems within his own family. But God, of course, continued to work with David's descendants as he had promised. But in the long run, Israel, as a nation under the rule of David's sons, fell into idolatry time and time again until eventually they were punished by God, sent into Babylonian captivity, and this brought on a new crisis in Israel's own history. In fact, Psalm 89 is a unique psalm in that it articulates the kind of confusion and disorientation in the hearts of the faithful people in Israel who were trusting in the promises that God gave to David. I want to cover some of the verses of this psalm just to relay to you the kind of crisis that Israel feels on this occasion, because to look out onto the historical landscape, David's seed has fallen, and yet God had made promises to David that he will always be with him, always be with his offspring, and there will always be a king, David, on the throne. So notice these early verses of Psalm 89. I will make known, says the psalmist, I will make known, God, your faithfulness to all generations, because I have said, mercy shall be built up forever. Your faithfulness, God, you shall establish in the very heavens. There was not a doubt in the faithful hearts of the good men and women of Israel that God was indeed a covenant-keeping God, that he was a God who could be trusted, and his word was certain and established even in the very heavens. And of course, God himself had said, I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to my servant David. This is reflecting the covenant back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Your seed, God says to David, I will establish forever and build up your throne to all generations. And so it would seem as if there is no possible way that David's descendants should cease from serving on the throne in Jerusalem. And this is what the psalm for the next 36 verses is contemplating. These great promises that everyone knows are trustworthy because of who these promises come from. When you get to verse 33, for example, he reiterates these promises that God said, my loving kindness I will not utterly take from David. I will not allow my faithfulness to fail. My covenant I will not break. See, these are explicit statements of covenant faithfulness on God's part. And yet, verse 38, but you, God, have cast off. You have abhorred. You have been furious with your anointed, with David. You have renounced the covenant of your servant. And so it is here for the next 12 verses that a huge sense of confusion and crisis sets in the minds of Israel. We know that God is the God of heaven. We know that God is faithful to his word. And yet we also know that his covenant has failed. From all appearances, I look out onto the historical landscape, says the faithful Israelite in these days, and there is no seed of David on the throne. The king of Babylon has conquered us, has carried us away into captivity. God's covenant has failed. And so how are we Israelites to continue with such a cognitive dissonance in our own hearts and minds? We believe God. We want to believe in him. And yet it seems as if all is lost. Well, it's going to be up to the prophets to make sense of it all. The prophets who will come and preach to Israel and make promises of God's faithfulness, of God's establishing his eternal kingdom in fulfillment of his eternal purposes. And many of those prophecies will be encouraging, and many of those prophecies will be confusing. And yet we, because of the New Testament and the explanations given there, we living on this side of history can look back on those promises and see a beautiful picture of the faithfulness of God, of the fulfillment that God had always intended to bring about, and the revelation of God as a redeeming God that he has always wanted to show himself to be. And that will lead us to our next series of lessons on the kingdom in prophecy. And we will look at several of these predictions, and we will see many great, beautiful promises about the nature of the kingdom that is to come and the nature of the Son of David, the true David, that will sit on that throne forever and ever.